Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razam Pereira. A defiant Boris Johnson hit back at the UK's top judges and vowed to take the country out of the European Union next month, despite suffering an unprecedented legal defeat over his Brexit strategy in the highest court in the land. In a sweeping rebuke to the Prime Minister, Britain's Supreme Court ruled that Johnson broke the law when he decided to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks in the run-up to the October 31st deadline for leaving the EU. He gave Queen Elizabeth II unlawful advice to pause the legislature, and his decision wrecked the ability of Britain's elected politicians to fulfill their crucial democratic role overseeing his government's actions, the court found. Johnson said he obviously respects the verdict but retaliated immediately. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyse the political crisis in the United Kingdom. Joining me on the program today are Ricky Chopra, International Counsel, Subir Sinha, Professor SOAS, University of London, VK Agnihotri, former Secretary General Rajya Sabha and constitutional expert, and Sheetal Sharma, Assistant Professor, Centre for European Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Agnihotri, I'd like to begin the program with you. The Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister's action of suspending Parliament, why has it been termed as unlawful and not unconstitutional by the Supreme Court?
The basic thing is that the UK doesn't have a constitution like India. India has a constitution. In UK there is no written constitution. So mostly the work there is done on the basis of conventions, and that is where there is no question of breaking the constitution. It is breaking the law, and law of the land is maybe written or unwritten. Of course, there is a law relating to the term of the parliament, but the court has not really gone into that, because that law was broken already on the 8th of June this year, when the elections were held. Mid-term elections were held, which are not permitted as per the law, but there are provisions that mid-term elections can be held under certain circumstances. So that is why, in terms of written or unwritten law, it is transgressing the powers and functions of the Parliament, which this decision of the Queen, based on the advice of the Prime Minister, by proroguing the Parliament, was considered to be unlawful.
Right. All right. So, Ricky Chopra, let me bring you into the picture now. As far as unwritten laws are concerned, does it complicate things? Does it make things more complex, really? We seem to have lost the line there with Ricky Chopra. If he rejoins us, I'll take that question to him. But let me bring in Sheetal Sharma now. So, does this ruling by the Supreme Court blow a hole in Johnson's political authority? What happens to Boris Johnson's political authority now?
There are a couple of dimensions from which we can understand this, Frank. Number one, this is a classic case of conflict between the representative democracy and the direct democracy, because the representatives want a different kind of scenario, whereas the direct democracy, which was based on the referendum that was held in 2016, it says something else. Now, Boris Johnson is caught between the two situations. Is he going to respond to the direct democracy, or is he going to respond to the representative democracy? Now, what is the situation? There are many ifs and buts in this situation. As you say, it's a constitutional crisis. Why it's not a constitutional crisis? Because in the first place, they do not have one. Constitutions all over the world, just like we have in India, this is a single document that defines various organs, and then they have a definition of what power they wield. But along with the sense of power, structure and functioning, they also have limitations to which they can do. Now, what Johnson has done, he has done a kind of tussle between the executive and the legislature. He is in a situation where he wants to exit Europe by any chance by 31st of October. Now, what he did, suspending the Parliament for 5 weeks, which has been revoked now. Now, the issue is that what he wanted to gain out of it, he wanted to suppress all the debate which was against his decision of exiting the European Union by 31st of October. Now, what has happened, if in case he wants to exit, he has to have the majority of people voting for it, because it's a no deal situation right now. They still want some time with European Union to negotiate a deal during the transition period, so that is not what is happening in the parliament. If he calls for a no confidence motion, then also it's a problem, because then it will give a 2-week gap for the other people to join together and form a government or propose it to the Queen. Now what happens? If in case he wants to propose another election, then also he needs 2/3 of the majority of the people, because the fixed term Parliament Act of 2011 now stops the executive in order to call a snap election. Now among all these situations, Boris Johnson is certainly, humiliated, as the newspaper reportings are also saying, and he is caught between many ifs and buts. Now what's the course for him? Now what he can do, he can once again convene, as it is going to happen today onwards, that the parliament comes, they debate over the issues, and then they talk about what is the possible scenario on the basis of which they can strike a deal with. In the meantime, what has happened, European Union, the other 27 member states have become very strong in terms of ossifying their stance that they are not going to relent to what UK is trying to say. And all other things which are the main problems in a no deal exit, they tend to remain the same. Nothing has happened on the Irish backstop, nothing has happened on the immigrant issues, people working there, and the payback deal. These are the three main contentions that UK has to overcome or has to have a possible solution. So if they remain part of the custom union, then nothing changes. So this is a kind of battle which is now between the leavers and the remainers.
Right.
And he is caught between the two, where the popular sentiment is saying something else, the representatives are saying something else, and he wants something else, but then utter chaos and confusion.
Absolutely. All right. So let me go across to Subir Sinha now. As far as the ruling of the Supreme Court is concerned, does it question the the Prime Minister's ability to remain in office as the principal advisor to the Queen, and does Jeremy Corbyn have a case in asking him to go?
The ruling does not ask for Boris Johnson to resign. So let us be clear on that. It is obviously a very big loss of face, and Jeremy Corbyn also at the Labour Party conference yesterday demanded that Boris Johnson should resign because he has now lost moral authority and his prorogation of parliament has been declared to be unlawful. He's also not personally culpable in the sense that we are not expecting to see him in prison or anything of that sort. Just to build up a little bit on what the previous guest said, the issue basically seems to be that the 52-48 vote in favor of leaving on a very simple yes-no referendum just does not provide clarity to elected representatives as to exactly what does leave mean. Now, Boris Johnson is a very canny politician. It was not clear that he was a leaver at the time of the referendum. So he expects that, sooner rather than later, the UK will go into elections.
Right.
And if that happens, he expects that if he takes a no-deal position, even if he is not able to deliver on a no-deal, then it is more likely that leavers will gravitate towards the Conservative Party and will bring him back to power. And if you look at opinion polls, despite the complete shambles that the Tories, including Boris Johnson, have made of the entire Brexit procedure, it seems that the Conservatives still have some lead against Labour and the Liberal Democratic Party. So as far as I can see, there will be calls for him to resign. He will actually not go ahead and resign. The prorogation has just been cancelled, not been revoked because it was illegal. And in fact, Parliament has met this morning at 11:30 with 42 urgent questions that were already tabled for discussion, going into today. What is going to be the role of Parliament in making the decision regarding Brexit?
Absolutely.
Because everyone expects elections will be held sooner rather than later, I think that it is not just a question of Brexit in its own right, but how Brexit is going to play out within the unfolding electoral politics that we are expecting to see in the coming weeks and months.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is the role of Parliament in all of this also needs to be discussed and analysed as well. But before that, Mr. Agnihotri, so when you look at Britain's executive, legislature and judiciary, where do the powers lie and how can they be exercised?
No,
Is there a clear demarcation?
In the parliamentary democracy, there is a separation of powers, and therefore each of these three wings have their own powers and functions, and they are very conscious about their powers, and therefore they are expecting the judiciary to deliver justice, because basically it is a quarrel or whatever between executive and the parliament, and that happens not only in UK but in India as well, because ultimately the executive is also member of the parliament. The prime minister and the ministers, they are all members of parliament, so they have two hats, and most of the time they are having their own executive authority to stress, and that is why the problems arise, and parliament and the judiciary has to come and justiciate in these matters. And not only in this case but even in India, both cases the judiciary is saying in this judgment that we are not going into the Brexit deal or politics or anything. We are only saying whether the advice given by the Prime Minister to the Queen to dissolve was a reasonable one based on some logic, on some reason, or was it some kind of a thing which cannot be justified.
Right.
Was it justifiable or not? That is the issue they have examined, and that is what they have ruled, that it was not justified.
Sure. All right. Ricky Chopra now rejoins us on the program. Ricky Chopra, as far as this whole issue of unwritten constitution is concerned, does it complicate things further? What are the challenges really?
All right, thank you for having me on the show. And sorry for joining in late, there was some technical difficulty. All right. So as the panelist, my friend was saying that, the judgment was very clear of the Honorable Supreme Court, that they would not go into the reason for Brexit, and they wouldn't, go into other reasons, and they would simply see if the power to prorogue was, constitutional or not. And amusingly, the judgment does not say that the act which the Prime Minister did was constitutional or unconstitutional. It said it was unlawful, and it also said that this judgment is not is also based on the fact that the act of suspension was actually not a proceeding of the Parliament. It was outside the proceedings of the Parliament, and therefore they have all the right, even given the Bill of Rights, they have all the right to come out with a ruling on that. Having said that, the first time, I think, to my knowledge and to my memory, the British the Supreme Court has for the first time come out very clearly, saying that the Supreme Court has powers to rule over those fringe areas where there was still always a doubt whether it's an act of proceeding of a parliament or it was basically a very executive proceeding. So I think the confusion has just increased now. One side is the legislature, and the other side is the executive and the courts now. So, and the referendum thrown in, which is the will of the power. And given the fact that UK or Britain does not have a written constitution, I think the confusion has just started.
Okay. And talking about this confusion, Sheetal Sharma, does the ruling of the Supreme Court further complicate the entire Brexit conundrum as well?
It will, certainly, because one, constitution exists in theory, what is happening in the parliament is practice, and what is happening on the streets in terms of referendum is emotion. So you tend to see a cocktail of these three things which do not stand with each other in the sense of sharing the same platform. In the absence of the constitution, there are limits to which you can understand that how much power is with one particular organ of the state and what are the limitations of it. As is being discussed, this is considered to be unlawful. They are not commenting on Brexit for or it or against it, but on the suspension of the...
But it's certainly going to have ramifications.
Absolutely. The second issue is that the same issue, when there was a petition which was raised in the Scottish court regarding the same issue, the lower court said it's a political matter and court does not have anything to say in it. But the higher court in Scotland, they turned down it, saying it unlawful, what the Supreme Court of England has said. Now the issue is that when in theory you do not have clear-cut delegation of duties, responsibilities, limitations to power, what will happen? The situation has unfolded in the parliament. Now what Boris Johnson has got couple of things, because he is also eyeing an election where, as the panelist from UK was saying, that he is knowing that he is going to win in any case, if in case it comes to the scene of election. But what has happened that since he is trying to garner his vote on the basis of the emotional sentiment that is being played on roads, then the situation is going to get complicated. Either you have a constitution, either you have a framework, or you have a theory which says that X is limited by this much or Y can do this much. But even in case of absence of this, then there is nothing. And that is why this is emerged, as we were discussing earlier also, that so far everything was decided on the basis of gentleman's agreement, customs, traditions, or the simple acts which were on the basis of agreement and legislation in the parliament was happening. But there are a couple of times in the history which has happened during the Cons Law or later on during the Irish issue. But then this is the situation which has unfolded recently. And this is where once again I would say that this is a conflict of democracy where representative and the direct democracies are at face with each other.
Right, all right. So, Subir Sinha, what happens to Brexit now? What's the road ahead for the entire Brexit issue?
Well, I think that there is no option but to take it back to the people. We have very strong feelings about the fact that the people have already spoken in 2016. But given what we know now about what Brexit will involve and the dramatic and negative impact it will have on the UK, if you just look at the political party spectrum, we have the Conservative Party within which there is a big split. But Boris Johnson says that he is for a no deal, if that is what it comes to. Labour has a strange position. It basically says that it will try to work for a deal, and then take it back to another referendum to the people, in which it says it will back Remain, because for Labour, Remain is better than any other option. And the Liberal Democrats, who have taken a very strong position, by which they mean that they are looking to revoke the referendum altogether, without necessarily looking to take it back to the people. So there is that particular issue. Going back onto the question of written versus non-written constitutions, it's very interesting that Brexit itself has brought out a massive demand in the population for the constitution to have a written form, precisely because of the kind of confusions that we are looking at the moment. And finally, what I'd like to say is it is exemplary, the behavior of the judiciary. I mean, we can compare it to our country or many other countries, that the judiciary has taken a very legalistic and a strongly apolitical position on this. As all of the panelists have said, they have not ruled on the legality or not, or the desirability or not of Brexit. They basically are looking at themselves as custodians of an unwritten constitution and of the public law. So, for example, the ruling itself that we saw yesterday is about Boris Johnson breaking the public law, by which they mean that his act of prorogation of Parliament went against the powers of Parliament as well as against the public interest. So I think not only is the path towards Brexit going to be very rocky, because many people on the Leave side have threatened for direct action, and there are threats to people who are involved in the litigation that came to judgment yesterday. Gina Miller, or the Indian origin from Guyana, businesswoman who has been a part of this particular litigation, but also some of the lawyers who have been named by right-wing newspapers and their phone number and their addresses have been published, do fear some amount of vigilante action. And if you just look at social media, you can see that a mood is building among the extreme leavers who would like nothing better than to, what they say, leave on WTO rules, in order to be able to get this thing done by the end of October. So I think it's a very murky period, and the only real solution is for parties to offer new choices to the electorate, either via another referendum or in a election to be held in the coming months.
Okay, all right. So going back to the people is the best way forward as far as Brexit is what you're suggesting. This is where I'd like to bring in Ricky Chopra as well. So I'm going to go back to the point that Subir Sinha was making about how the Supreme Court has stepped in, and you yourself observed that probably this is one of the first times that it is reacted on such a kind of an issue. So why have the court stepped in at this point in time, and on what tenets has the apex court made the ruling?
All right. Now the Apex Court has made the ruling very clearly stating that since this was not any proceeding inside the Parliament, we have all the right to say anything about it. If the act of procurement was an act which was happening inside the parliament, they are clear that they wouldn't have stepped in or said something or made a ruling on that. But since they consider it an act which was outside the purview of the parliament and parliament accountability, therefore they had all the rights. So they're clear, keeping them very clear of any judicial or executive clash or legislative clash. And first of all, they say that this is not an act of parliament, therefore the courts have all the right. And it doesn't come to my mind, if they have said it in the past as well, because I couldn't recall any judgment or any ruling where they said it earlier. Now, simply the fight was between sovereign responsibility and sovereign freedom. As the panelist was earlier saying that, whether the executive or the legislative should have the say. The court has very clearly said that no one but the judiciary will have the say. Referendum happened back in 2016, so I don't think, to the best of my judgment, that again, things will be thrown back to the people and another referendum will happen. I think simply they will come out with the legislation now, since the parliament is sitting again, to have another statute or another bill passed which would, delimit the powers of the Prime Minister and, hold the elections as per, what the opposition wants.
Okay, all right, Mr. Agnihotri. So, where does this leave us now? How does the political crisis in the UK get resolved? What's the best way forward?
You see, the clock is ticking. 31st October is the time given by EU for this whole thing. And one of the, in Indian Parliament, laws lapse only when the Parliament is dissolved. But their prorogation has the same effect. And that is what the Prime Minister was trying to do, that the earlier law will lapse, and some new law will have to come, and this thing, that thing, discussion will go on, and this thing and that thing. Now, as the panelists were saying, I think referendum is out of the question. The clock is ticking. It only is, the issue is whether the opposition, you see, again in UK, they don't have the law that we have about being disqualified for voting or going against your party's whip or whatever.
Anti-defection law.
Anti-defection law is not there. And that is what has happened. That is how the earlier laws regarding Brexit have been defeated. And that is where it will be up to the opposition, whether they are more comfortable with getting some of the conservatives into their fold to vote for whatever is to be required, or go for a fresh election.
Sure. Right. All right. So, Subir Sinha, where does all of this leave the people of the UK really?
Yeah, just a minor correction on the previous point. There have been people leaving the Conservative Party for the Liberal Democratic Party in the last sitting of Parliament. There have also been people who have left various political parties to form new parties like the Change UK and things like that. So even the and in the case of the Conservative Party, if you remember, just before prorogation, Parliament voted against a no-deal exit, and they basically now have made that into a parliamentary act. So Boris Johnson has to respect that, otherwise he'll be seen in contempt of Parliament. Because how he retaliated was he so-called removed the whip from these 22 Conservative members of Parliament, in effect making them no longer a member of the Conservative Party. This includes previous chancellors like Kenneth Clarke. This includes some highly senior members of Boris Johnson and Theresa May's own cabinet. So this is taking a toll on the various political parties in terms of the fact that no party, except for maybe the Liberal Democrats, are fully united behind either a leave option or behind a remain option. As far as how I see the next weeks unfolding, now that Parliament is back, and there is no deal, and now that no deal has been taken off the table, one option is, and Boris Johnson has said he is not going to choose that particular option, is to ask for the European Union for a further extension. One way to do that the European Union would like to see something like a workable deal, or at least work towards a deal, in order for it to be able to convince its 27 members that the UK deserves to have an extension. That the European Union representatives have so far said that they have seen little or no movement. And as one of the panelists earlier pointed out, there are some intractable issues, the Irish backstop being one, and also the idea that you could retain some benefits of the European Union while not taking the responsibility for free movement of labor. These are really sticking points. And that takes me back to my original point, which is that a referendum, which is a yes or no referendum, in or out referendum, cannot really provide institutional form to the emotional expression of 52% of the population wanting to leave the European Union. Okay,
Right.
so no further questions were asked about what exactly does leave mean, and direct democracy or not, that is a very major problem as far as referendum-oriented issues are concerned, which
Sure.
is that a yes or no vote does not give clear enough instructions to elected representatives to be able to enact that into a workable treaty.
Right. All right. And Shital Sharma, close the show for us with your concluding remarks on the best way forward.
The best way forward is to ask for some more time, which would be like another 3 months up to 31st of January 2020. If you go for another election, what if the same hung kind of decision comes out to be? So on one hand, you have extreme hard Brexit, on another you have a soft Brexit, but you have to find a way out to have a semi-soft Brexit so that at least people do not bear the shock of leaving the European Union just at one point of time overnight.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, whether or not we will see a solution in the weeks to come or by 31st October remains to be seen. But all we can say for now is that it's going to be a very challenging and murky period going forward. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.